Welcome back to Inside Biotech. I'm your co-host, Riley Conover Elmer. For those who may be new, Inside Biotech is brought to you by BCLA, a nonprofit organization dedicated to inspiring, educating, and connecting emerging scientists and entrepreneurs to help grow and diversify the biotech ecosystem in Los Angeles. On this podcast, we invite you inside one of the fastest growing sectors in Southern California. Here, we bridge science with storytelling to bring you the most novel, up-to-date, and thrilling news on the biotech world in SoCal. If you want to stay informed about current progress and developments in the biotech industry, you're in the right place. Twice a month, my co-host Karishma Chhugani and I sit down with scientists, founders, investors, and industry leaders to explore the cutting-edge work happening inside their companies and to share diverse perspectives from across niches and career stages in biotech. Today, we have a very special episode talking about scientific writing, what it is, what is good writing, how can we be better at writing, and how can we motivate ourselves to write. And luckily, you get both of us this time. So Karishma and I are both here.
Hi, everyone. So today, Riley and I are doing an episode on becoming a better scientific writer. So we're going to be going over what is good scientific writing, becoming a better writer, and how that starts with becoming a better reader. And then how it's important to schedule out your writing sessions. And we're both PhD students, candidates, in fact, and we have to do quite a bit of writing, whether it is manuscripts or grants. We also have to present our writing in different formats, such as like poster presentations, conferences, or even full-on presentations. So I think it'll be really informative for all that are watching.
Yeah, Karishma, because you and I are both sort of in the tail end of PhD, which is where a majority of the scientific writing takes place, although you have it throughout all the steps. But I feel like this is when experiments start to wind down and all of a sudden you blink and see a Microsoft document like in your dreams, or this is where the scientific writing is all-consuming. So how is your writing going, by the way?
Approximately a month out from defending my PhD, and we are deep in writing mode right now. I'm working on 2 different manuscripts, working on formatting the thesis and figuring out which chapters you want to include in thesis, how you want that to flow. And it's been a lot, but when you're in the mode, you just crank in and we're going to get it done. But it also, I think, helps you kind of reflect on how much you've done as a PhD student and how much you have to write about. Not only do you have to look at previously published literature, but you also have to essentially find insights from your research and connect it back to what has been published already. Are you extending previous findings? Are you finding something novel? Is your work translational? That's a big part of my PhD. My title is Pharmaceutical and Translational Sciences. And so a big part of what we focus on is the research that you're doing, is that translational? And what translational means is essentially from the bench to the bedside. So at the bench, we're doing all this research, and then the bedside is in the clinic. So all the research that you're doing, is it applicable to patients in the clinic? And a lot of it is not at the moment because we still need to advance technology. We still need to make things more cost effective.
Yeah, so I want to build on that too, because you're sort of connecting your specific scientific work or research to the broader world. And I want to have a clarification here of what makes scientific writing unique. I, growing up, really enjoyed like creative writing and narrative writing, and lots of in English classes when you had to write in MLA format, and there were all of these annotated bibliographies. And scientific writing is its own beast and has its own special set of rules. So what are your thoughts on what makes scientific writing separate and unique from other forms, or even from a scientific article that you might read on Google or on a pop science website?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, is that you have to go out onto Google and make sure you're on Google Scholar, because you want to be looking up publications that are actually peer reviewed. It's based on, are you looking to expand your own knowledge in a field that you're not even working on? Or are you trying to expand on what your current research is and create that background for readers so that they can connect eventually what your research is talking about? It just really depends on what angle you're writing from. And I think that's what makes the scientific publications different.
Yeah, than like normal writing. So with something like creative writing, or if you're going to go read a novel, we have things like an exposition, intro, you're introduced to the characters, and then there's a journey that peaks at like this climactic event, and then there's sort of a wrap up at the end. And one thing that I was really surprised by with scientific writing is a good scientific paper can still tell you a story. It just does it in a very clear and concise way. So we have things like the introduction, we have methods, results, and a discussion section that are pretty explicitly laid out, not like a novel. It just tells you exactly what it is. But if you have research question or sort of a storyline that you want to help guide your readers through, show them the data, sort of walking them through the intro, what they need to know, and then through the methods of how you got there, the results showing how the data that you got led you to this conclusion, and then sort of wrapping it up in the discussion. I actually have found a lot of creative output from finding that storyline and being able to do it in like the specific way that scientists publish their papers. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think it is all about telling a story. You don't want to lose your reader in that deep scientific jargon that we use. And so I think it is important to have that sort of story throughout, starting with the intro. What background, what am I focusing on? And like, what is the hypothesis of the research? Like, what are we expecting to find? And that builds on what has already been done in the field with previous literature. And that's why you have to do a lot of literature search. And after you've kind of established your readers what it is that you're trying to look for in your research or that you're expecting to find, you move on to the methods section. And how did you conduct your research? What tools or experiments did you conduct? And what is the technology behind all of that got you to your final results? And after the methods section, you have the results section where you present your results as they are and try to make those connections with previous research. And then your discussion where you talk about maybe the strengths of your study, how you're filling in the gaps of the field and future implications and also limitations of your study. I think it's important to acknowledge that as well.
I also think that a key difference between scientific writing and everyday or creative writing is this idea of do not leave things ambiguous, or there is not room for inference or trying to guess what people are thinking. That was when I wrote my first paper or had drafted a scientific paper for the first time. I was so concerned because I was an early career. I was a lab tech and felt like I didn't have to include everything in the intro or everything in the methods or results because I thought people that are more experienced than me would already sort of know this or have this background. But you do not want to make those assumptions. You want to be leading with clarity at every single step, one sentence for every step that you took that will give you all of the background. So if someone read your paper from scratch, they could at least get the gist of it and kind of understand your paper's weight, even by reading the abstract or having that introduction.
So I think when you are writing scientifically, sometimes it's easy to get lost in that scientific jargon because you might understand what that is. You've been dealing with those terms, working with those terms these past few years, but not everyone in the audience who's reading your paper has. And so I think it's important to maintain a balance of where you're explaining those scientific terms, but you're also not taking away from the complexity of your research. That's something that I try to follow myself.
Yeah, so let's move on to the first steps in becoming a better scientific writer. And this is going to lead to reading and critically analyzing scientific papers, because the more you read, the more you can understand and decide and see what makes a good paper and what makes a poorly written paper, because not all scientific articles are created equal. There's a few key tips and tricks that Karishma and I have put together as to improving your ability to read and scan quickly and efficiently, because we often see that these papers are dozens of pages, dissertations, hundreds of pages, and there is not time to read every word of every single paper that is out there on your research topic. But you can usually get the biggest amount of information and get what you need out of a paper paper by just scanning maybe a few pages?
I think becoming a better writer starts with becoming a better reader. And so I think when you are going through publications, it can be sometimes intimidating. There are some publications that are not in my field, and to be able to like open that up and tackle it can be a feat in itself. So I think what's important is when you do open a publication, you want to start with maybe the abstract. You want to understand what the essence of the paper is, because in the abstract, they usually will tell you a little background, a little bit of the methods, a little bit of the results, and kind of like the conclusion. And so it's like a good starter for you before you like actually go in deep to the paper. So I would start out with reading the abstract and maybe looking through some of the figures. Sometimes you're really interested in just figuring out like, oh, like I wonder what experimental method or computational tool a researcher used. All I want to do is literally just go to the methods. And so you can just literally go to the methods and see that. Or sometimes you want to learn more about a disease. So you want to go into the background and read that. And then if you're really interested in the results, you can also go through the result and read through that. Sometimes I also go through and I only go to read the abstract and the discussion, because I feel like abstract is a very like concise, short summary of the entire paper. And the discussion kind of ties everything together. It highlights the key findings, but then also talks about the limitations of the study, what future implications are. And so for me, I think that kind of ties everything together. But how about you, Riley? What do you do when you read publications?
Yeah, I think I hit it in the same order where I'll go abstract. And if it sounds like something that's applicable to what I'm looking for, then I will skip to either the figures. And I mean, some figures are really easy to read and some are just leave me more confused, which we can talk about how to make your figures less confusing later. But yeah, going to the discussion, which is where it talks about the application of the results and especially the limitations. I think we forget that one paper in isolation is not going to teach you everything and is not sufficient to have a hard stance on any given topic or theory that's in development. And so the limitations are what can really help you contextualize these results. As a scientist, you're supposed to disseminate large amounts of information, large amounts of papers, and what the consensus of the community is. So I would say that the limitations usually in the discussion are essential to read and learn, especially if you're going to be citing that paper or you're going to use it to sort of build your framework of the topic of interest. The other thing that I do that is really helpful for reading results quickly, or if I found a paper that is highly relevant to what I'm doing, I like to see it, I'll print it out. And I will use a highlighter, and I have two different color highlighters. So one will be an orange one that I use for methods or like protocols that I can incorporate into my analysis pipeline or improve how I'm doing data collections or experiments. And then I have a pink highlighter that I'll use for topics or principles or pieces of background information that are really relevant to what I'm doing. And it makes it a lot easier when I'm going back. And you can do this on the computer too. But when I'm scanning back through articles, it gives me a chance to know what was the most important thing to me, what would I want to put in my introduction and things like that. So highly recommend, if there's the smaller subset of articles that you're reading to get the full information out of, separating your highlights by protocol driven versus information driven. That was really helpful for me. Was there anything else that was helpful for you or a tip that you've had as you've done the big literature searches?
Something that I have been recently doing is there are going to be publications that you absolutely never look at again, that you read and it like goes in one ear, comes out the next. And then there are other publications that you're actually going to cite later on or that are like very relevant to your research. And so sometimes what I do for the publications that are really relevant to my research is I kind of make a mini like PowerPoint presentation on it. Very quick, very concise, like just like quick background methods. Sometimes I put in the figures, but it really depends on like if it's too dense, I won't. That's too much extra work. But it kind of just serves as like a reminder of what that publication was. Like if I want to quickly go through and look instead of like scanning through the whole paper again. So I've been working on that for some of my publications that I've been reading. And I'm like, I know I'm going to cite this in a future manuscript that I want to publish. So let me just have it on file when I want to access it. And also another thing is I think it's also a good habit to create folders like on your desktop and save publications based on different categories so that you're not like thinking in your head, like, oh, like, what was that publication again? It was really good. I can't remember the name of it. And so if you just kind of like bookmark it and put it in different folders, I think that will also be helpful with ease of access.
Yeah, I totally agree. Using things like EndNote or Mendeley, things like that are also a good way to organize those articles. Also, what you're describing sounds like a version of an annotated bibliography, which if I know a lot of undergrads have done that and are like cringing or groaning at me saying that out loud. But I actually had an undergrad do an exercise where they did an annotated bibliography for me. And it was so good for them because they really understood when they went to write a poster abstract and submit it to a conference. He had all of the background that he needed. And it really helped me too, so that now, instead of me having to scan through every single abstract, he had written a paragraph where I was able to say, relevant, this is why, not relevant. And so those routine kind of obnoxious annotated bibliographies actually makes a big difference when it comes down to compiling all of your writing.
Another important skill is scheduling out your writing sessions. So Riley, what tips do you have in regards to that?
Yeah, I have actually found it fascinating how many people struggle with this. And I was at an academic conference and there was a whole panel and this room was full and it was all about scientific writing and just the motivation. And most of the people in the audience were tenure or tenure track faculty. I was one of the least experienced, and all of the faculty there were talking about how difficult it is to find time to write, to find the motivation to write, and things get bogged up with your schedule, that writing is sort of like always on the to-do. And so it gets pushed off every day. It just kind of tacked on to the next day's to-dos. I don't know if you've felt this with dissertation writing, but
I'm feeling it right now.
Exactly. And it's like, well, it has to get done. Otherwise you can't graduate or you can't submit the grant. They had some tips that I thought were helpful. Number one, and maybe this is more common knowledge, but I found it so helpful that instead of having paragraph goals or even like page goals for a day, just doing word count. So having a number of words that you have to require for yourself, which I find really helpful because then I can jump back and forth between a paragraph and results or methods. And it's really easy to track in my document and I can get it down to like, I have 50 words left. How many more sentences can I write? And that to me was way more helpful, the most helpful type of goal. So having word goals, not necessarily like page or paragraph goals.
That's awesome. I've actually never heard of that. And I think that's actually also really useful because when you're deciding what journal you want to submit your paper to, they will often have a word count limit. So sometimes you might be cranking away and writing way over the limit and you're going to have to eventually cut it down. So I think it's a good tip to actually think about the types of journals that you want to publish your research in and go and look at the requirements of that journal and kind of make sure you're within the limits there.
What has been helping you stay motivated?
You've just been on this journey for such a long time, and the last few months is really like the home stretch. And this is your opportunity to summarize what you've done. This is why you're doing a PhD. And so it is a lot of work and it is very tiring for sure. But at the same time, it's really exciting and like motivating in itself that like, let's see like, how these results come together and like where we can publish and like hopefully one day this work can become translational or like at least be a point where someone else can start from there and start their next 5 years and further the research. And so just having that internal drive and motivation, it is important to get through these last few months.
When you're writing a manuscript, let's say you want to submit it for publication, is there an order that you usually start in terms of intro, methods, results, discussion? How do you usually tackle that?
I usually start with intro and methods kind of because methods is already like it's all done. And so it's like, let me put that on the page. I think for me, intro actually takes a bit because that is where you are holding the story. So if the story is not straight there, then your like results and conclusion and discussion won't make sense, but like it won't follow in the right order. So I actually think that the intro takes me the longest to complete because you have to put in the right background about the disease that you're working with or the condition or whatever you're researching. And then you have to do a bit of a literature search. What else in the field has already been done? How are you addressing those limitations? And what is your hypothesis? Like, how are are you going to extend this? So that takes a bit of time. So for me personally, the intro takes the longest.
I usually end up saving the intro for the end because of that reason, where it feels like every sentence has to be cited. I start with the methods because I feel like I can bust out the methods, everything that I did. It's already written in different places. The words just come so quickly. And then I usually go to result. And then one thing that's helped me is as I'm writing the results, I will have sort of the insights of I'll need to explain this in the discussion or contextualize this. And so I'll write my results and then put a bullet point or like a subheading in the discussion as I'm going through, so that while I'm doing the results, I'm not writing anything in the discussion, but I'm sort of gathering all of my discussion points. And that has really, really helped me. And then at the end, I go back through the intro and kind of be like, how do I get them to this point?
And don't even get started with supplementary material, because that is a whole different beast. Everything that doesn't make it in the manuscript, you're like, okay, supplementary. Hopefully someone will scroll through that one day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're a lot of work. The figures are a lot of work, like editing those, making sure they fit the formatting of the journal. All of that is very journal specific, so you'll have to make sure that you're extremely thorough with journal guidelines. But yeah, in terms of just motivation and getting the writing done, when you know your work, it's a lot more fun to sit down and say, let me now put into words everything that I know about this topic. And it can almost seem like cathartic in a way. So rely on your co-authors. They should be doing a portion of the writing or figure making, like they are there for a reason. Anything that you want to add about co-authorship or anything there?
I think with co-authors, I think it's really a symbiotic relationship. I think you should establish your roles early on before you start writing the manuscript, just so that there's no discrepancies later of like who's doing what and the ordering and all this stuff. So I think it's important to establish that relationship early on, set your boundaries very clearly that, okay, I'm doing this, you're doing this. And at the end, you'll all look over the manuscript and give each other feedback. It should be like collaborative. It should be healthy, not toxic.
Don't feel like you need to wait until you have a full draft to send it to co-authors or to your mentor. Take it in sections. Sometimes that's better for especially refining the methods or the story, so it prevents large-scale revisions later on. Yeah, clarifying those expectations is always helpful. We've had such a great discussion. Karishma, are there any other last-minute pieces of advice about scientific writing or reading that you want our audience to know?
I think we covered a lot, but I would just say don't be afraid to jump into articles and take that time to become a better reader, because I think that is a skill that stays with you for a very long time, and that also translates in how you write. So I hope that this podcast episode has been helpful or informative for you guys.
Thanks everyone for listening in, and we will see you next time.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Inside Biotech, hosted by Riley, Conover, Elmer, and Karishma Chhugani. Inside Biotech is produced by Biotech Connection Los Angeles. I would like to thank our production team, Stephanie Wu, Daniel Ars, Brian Jimenez, Daniel Liu, Sanju Vardhan, and Ethan Chung. Thank you to our sponsors, Magnify at CNSI, USC Bridge Institute, KGI, LA Biospace, Technova, and Amgen for their support. For information about upcoming BCLA events, visit bc-la.org or find us on social media at Inside Biotech. If you're interested in partnering with Inside Biotech as a potential partner or speaker, contact our team at bc-la.org. We invite you to follow us on your preferred podcast service and leave us a 5-star review. See you next time.